good to be together again this evening. Again, we'll focus our attention on the 20th Psalm and take a different approach and different perspective from that Psalm, as Jesus himself, notice he said that while the Psalms had a specific context in which they were written, and there's so much value to the lessons of strength that we looked at here this morning with David, the things that he faced, but it's amazing how through Christ they take on another dimension. In other words, we are also able to look at many of these Psalms as they were foreshadowing the various things that Jesus would experience. And through that, it offers almost a whole nother element for us to gain insight as we realize how Jesus himself was able to accomplish the various things that he did, recognizing that he himself always gave credit not to his own physical demeanor or his own physical flesh. In fact, the Bible said there would be nothing of him physically, that it wouldn't be appealing. There would be nothing physically that would be of any strength or value. It was what was inside that body of casing that the Spirit was dwelling in. It was Christ in the flesh, and he was able to accomplish a great victory himself. And that's what we want to look at here this morning. It's interesting as we are about to look at Psalm 20 in that context. It seems very apparent that this has to be talking about the victory that Jesus achieved when he went to the cross. Remember, specifically this morning, there was a passage, there's a section in Psalm 20 where it says, because this is the Lord's anointed, surely God would save him. We read that in Psalm chapter 20 in verse 6. And what's so amazing is that Psalm chapter 20, about what he's about to face in that trial, several of the other Psalms following Psalm 20 are exactly about that. In fact, we find Psalm 22, just a couple Psalms later, we find Jesus himself actually quoted this Psalm. It begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? And truly what's amazing is that within Psalm 22 are all of the various occasions that happened while Jesus was suffering on the cross. We read of the individuals that were gambling for the clothing. We read of the sarcastic, vicious attitude that his oppressors had, taunting him on the cross, saying, come down from the cross and save yourself. And how they sneered at him. And Psalm 22 covers all of these things. It takes on a whole other wonderful dimension as we realize this was indeed speaking about how Jesus would suffer through these things and how we would overcome that ultimate suffering. Well, then we move forward to Psalm 23. And of course we see how it's so fitting of the shepherd who was risen from the dead. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 20 speaks of that shepherd who rose from the dead. There it says, now the God of peace who brought up from the dead the great shepherd of the sheep. And so we see what was the result of that victory. He was able to be a guide and to shepherd and lead us who follow him. And then there is Psalm 24, which speaks of the ultimate victory he has, and that he is able to be our intercessor. Speaks of the great king, says, who will stand before the King of glory? Who is able to approach the throne? It is the King of glory, Jesus himself, who is spotless and sinless, who was able to intercede for the sins of mankind. And so given the fact that we have this sequence of Psalms, all of them pointing to Jesus, it seems so fitting that, in other words, when we sit down on Psalm 20 from the perspective of Jesus, what do we find? Well, what we find is what Jesus experienced before he went and experienced all these things, the great battle in Gethsemane. Remember, the context of this psalm is David had all kinds of people surrounding him that were chanting these things. Remember, the context was that the king was about to face a great challenge, and to give him that strength and encouragement he needed, he had all these individuals shouting and praying and encouraging him. Well, we find Jesus tried to get his entourage of people to do that very thing for him. Remember when he was in Gethsemane, he said he brought his disciples to do what? To pray with him, to pray for him. And you know what's so ironic about this and this is the complete opposite of David. While the people around David had faith, the people around David had strength, the people around David were saying, we know that you're going to accomplish this. And here Jesus specifically tells his disciples why they're there. In fact, in Luke chapter 18, we read Jesus specifically tells them, there's a battle we're about to face, that I'm going to face, and I'm going to literally be beaten, mocked, humiliated. I'm going to be killed, and 3 days later, rise again. So no doubt the battle that Jesus was facing was the willingness to even go there. That was the battle he was facing. And he asked his disciples constantly to surround him with this sense of strength and camaraderie. In fact, if you would, back up there to Luke chapter 18. And notice how Jesus plainly reveals this to his disciples. In Luke chapter 18, beginning in verse 31, it says, Then he took the 12 aside and said to them, Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and all things which are written through the prophets about the Son of Man will be accomplished. For he will be handed over to the Gentiles, and will be mocked, and mistreated, and spit upon. And after they have scourged him, they will kill him. And the third day, he will rise again. Well, we fast forward over to Matthew, in Matthew chapter 26, where Jesus finds himself finally in the garden, where he's moments away from having all these things begin to take place. And notice, what does he do? He brings his disciples, his entourage. And what is he saying? I need you. I need your prayers. I need you at this most crucial time, the battle to go to the cross on behalf of the sins of mankind. And the irony here is while David had his entourage of people encouraging him, Jesus couldn't find it. He literally could not find it. He found them sleeping. Just 3 times he went to them and finds them and tried to encourage them. I need you to watch and pray with me. Like notice in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 36. It says in verse 36, Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, Sit here while I go over there and pray. And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee and began to be grieved and distressed. Then he said to them, My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me. And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. In other words, the crucial element of what Jesus was actually battling was self-will. It was the battle of what I want, what I prefer, what I wish would happen versus what is the actual will of God. That was the battle that he was facing. It wasn't this military battle that David was facing, but it was more of an internal battle. And we see that's no wonder why he wants his disciples around him, encourage him. And no doubt as Jesus calls upon Psalm 22 from the cross, no doubt he would have had to have in his mind Psalm 20 and other psalms that talk about the victory and the encouraging factor of calling upon God and letting God lift you up that you might be successful. No doubt this had to be something that he's hoping would give him that sense of confidence and strength. Because he falls on his face and he begins praying, and this is what he's battling with. And notice what he says in verse 39. He went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. The just absolute difficulty of that. This is what I would prefer. But if that's not what you will, if you see something better in my suffering, help me to accept it and understand. He's praying this prayer that I want to accept that is what will lead to victory. And he again, goes to his disciples, and he finds them sleeping. Notice in verse 42. He went again a second time and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done." Again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. You know the battle Jesus was facing. In fact, in Luke, when he reveals these things, says his sweat was like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And this was an intense moment for Jesus. He's literally battling through this. And in verse 43, it says, "Again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them again and went away and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, 'Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand.'" What's truly amazing is that within Psalm 20 is a revelation of the exact issue is what he's going through. In Psalm 20, verse 4, says that in letting God be victorious is about letting our will be aligned with his will. That was the first thing that really came to mind of these individuals, was saying, as long as you have aligned your will with what God's plans are, surely he's going to give you victory. But ultimately what we find is that that's not always as easy as it seems. It's not an easy thing to say, just let me want the things you want, because when God says, well, what I want involves a little bit of pain, a little bit of suffering, some hardship, some very, very difficult days ahead, we're like, Jesus, please let this pass from me. Let that be the victory, that I don't have to endure it at all. Isn't that amazing as we look at Psalm 20? Let's go back there to Psalm 20 and notice again, see it in its context and how this is so fitting to what Jesus was battling in the garden. Is remarkable. But here's the prayer again. Psalm 20, verse 1. "May the Lord answer you in the day of trouble." And this is a day of trouble for Jesus. He says, "May the name of the God of Jacob set you securely on high. May he send you help from the sanctuary and support you from Zion. May he remember all your meal offerings and find your burnt offering acceptable. May he grant you your heart's desire and fulfill all your counsel." In other words, Jesus later revealed that part of our own spiritual battles that we're going to face is that very issue. Praying and accepting that we must put to death our own personal wants and wishes and desires in life. Then we must put those aside. In fact, go to Galatians chapter 2, where we find how Paul was able to find this. And he describes it in very excruciating detail, saying, again, this wasn't easy. It's not easy. Paul says something actually had to happen before Paul could allow his will to be aligned with Jesus' will, with God's will. He said, I had to crucify my flesh. I know we read over this, it's one simple statement, but as we know, as Jesus went through crucifixion, how difficult, how hard. As even Jesus himself was wrestling with that of going to the crucifixion, and he's praying how difficult this is going to be. Hopefully we can align ourselves and realize we are not alone when we realize that, when we admit that's a battle. Jesus was literally battling this. That's exactly what's going on. He's battling the idea of this is what I want, and I need to come to terms with accepting what you are telling me I have to do. And when that involves pain, when that involves difficulty, I have a hard time accepting it or even seeing how that could possibly lead to something good. And notice, Paul said, we literally have to crucify our flesh, that is our desires. We must crucify our personal wants and wishes. We must be willing and faith to realize that, in other words, until we win that battle, we cannot win the other battles ahead of us. Because all of these battles are internally to begin with. It's a battle within ourselves. And Jesus shows us how difficult but how amazing it is when we win that battle. So notice that as Paul tells us in Galatians chapter 2, beginning in verse 19, Paul says, "For through the law I died to the law, so that I might live to God." He says, "I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me." In other words, Paul, who was an amazing student of the Old Testament, he was a scholar of the Old Testament. Imagine what it must have been like for Paul to read Psalm 20 and realize, Jesus shows me what this is all about. Jesus! Because I realized the true battle is what Jesus faced. It was literally crucifying our own personal whims and what we think we know, what we want for ourselves, what we think might be the best thing for ourselves, and being willing to put that all aside and literally through faith and obedience, put it to death. To stop following what we think is the right thing for ourselves. To stop trusting what we think would be good because we are deceived by our own personal wants and wishes. The heart is deceptive. And so that ultimate battle takes place within our hearts and our minds to be obedient. And Jesus is the one who shows us how to do it, just as David showed us how to do that when it's a battle of some magnitude that we're also facing. But we must be willing to win that battle. And again, as we pointed out, well, what do you do when you want to do that? When as the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. It seems like you're all alone. It seems like no one else understands. Nobody else seems to have the same encouraging thoughts. You know, it's one thing where David had a whole chorus of people who said, "Yes, David, this is what you got to do. Yes, David, we know you're going to do it. Yes, David, you're going to be successful." Jesus didn't have that. He was literally all alone. Nobody around him had the same thought. They're sleeping. They don't understand the magnitude of this. They don't even understand. They don't even want him to die. Well, what does the Psalm 20 say? It's amazing. What does Psalm 20 say? God will send you help from on high, from Zion. And what do we read happening? There was an angel who came to help him. When it seems like we are all alone, we really are not. God literally had someone come from Zion and help him through this battle. We read that it's amazing over in Luke chapter 22 as Luke gets so much more vivid in detail. Luke chapter 22, as we read in verse 39, it says, "And he came out and proceeded as was his custom to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples also followed him. When he arrived at the place, he said to them, 'Pray that you may not enter temptation.' And he withdrew from them about a stone throw. And he knelt down and began to pray, saying, 'Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done.'" In other words, when Jesus said, "Pray that you may not enter temptation," he was saying, fight the temptation to follow your will. Fight the temptation to follow what you think is best. Because what they thought was best is, Jesus, you're going to sit on the throne in Jerusalem and we're going to destroy these Romans. That's the temptation he was speaking about. Because Jesus was being tempted with it. He said, I know what it's like to want something and to think it's the absolute best thing for you. But the question is that what God wants? And that is a battle. And the ultimate battle that Jesus was willing to go through. And it's truly amazing. He was not alone. And that we find amazingly in verse 43, an angel came and strengthened him. That's the promise of Psalm 20. God will send help. Well, what is it? How? When it seems like no one else around me seems like they're able to help me. Oh, there are those who can help that we don't often see are helping. How about Hebrews chapter 5? Turn to Hebrews chapter 5. Hebrews chapter 1, Hebrews chapter 1. And note verse 13. Hebrews chapter 1 verse 13 says, but to which of the angels has he ever said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation? I find that encouraging. God has ministering spirits that are there to help us. In other words, yes, the ideal situation, like David, for have a whole bunch of people that share our challenge and want us to do the right thing and are going to encourage us to do the right thing. That was ideal for David. He had that. What about a situation where it seems like that's few and far in between, if not even at all? We are never alone. What a comforting thought. We are never, ever truly alone. God will offer help. He will promise. He will offer something if we put our faith and trust in Him to seek Him. Because that is what Jesus is doing here. As we go back to Psalm 20, in this context, we see, what is Jesus doing? He's doing exactly what the psalmist says to do. Call upon God for help. And trust that there are going to be those who will send encouragement, reinforcements. Psalm 20 verse 1, may the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of the God of Jacob set you securely on high. May He send you help from the sanctuary and support you from Zion. May He remember all your meal offerings and find your burnt offering acceptable. And notice verse 4, here's the key. May He grant your heart's desire. What he was honest about was that my heart's desire is to get away from this. But if that's not what you want, help me make it my heart's desire. Let me accept it. That's what he's fighting. And notice verse 6. How did he get through it? Verse 6. Now I know that the Lord saves His anointed. In other words, I have confidence now more than ever that if I'm crucified viciously and horrifically on this cross, God's going to deliver me another way. There is going to be a resurrection. Whereas he's confident in all these things he's told the disciples. He's confident that certainly God is going to deliver him in this fashion. He will answer him from His holy heaven with the saving strength of His right hand. Some boast in chariots and some in horses. But we will boast in the name of the Lord our God. They have bowed down and fallen, but we have risen and stood upright. Save, O Lord. May the King answer us in the day we call. What's truly amazing about this is because Jesus went through this. That's the promise of Hebrews. He is able to come to the aid of us who are tempted like this. He's the one now we're calling. Jesus, and through all the things that He's done and exemplified, He's the one that can provide us that help and give us that assurance that He went through these things. He suffered this way, and He had to rely upon God as we are being called to rely upon God ourselves. And I love the whole summation of this in Hebrews chapter 5. Turn to Hebrews chapter 5. Since Jesus Himself put His trust in Scripture, He put His trust in God. He put His trust that God would send individuals to help Him. Yes, if it wasn't physical, it would be spiritual. There were angels that were ministering to Him, that were helping Him. And then we get to turn to Him Because we find out that, yes, God did deliver him, not in the way that maybe Jesus initially wanted, but it was another way, where first suffering and hardship had to take place. But notice what we read in Hebrews 5 and verse 7. It says, in the days of his flesh, he offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears. And no doubt Psalm 20 was a big support of that, as Psalm 22 was on his mind when he's on the cross. Lord, save me. Help me accept that my heart's desire would be what you want. With loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his piety. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation. In other words, what he learned was that sometimes the first battle we have to fight is the battle of our own wants and desires. And even in the midst of it, it seems like, well, if I crucify that simply means more hardship, more difficulty, more trials. The reason we need to win that battle is because it's about then putting our faith and trust that God will find the way and deliver us through the rest of that walk, just as he did with Jesus. Initially, Jesus wanted delivered from that pain and trial, but when God told him no, the answer is you must suffer. He then gave himself to God in full trust, recognizing that, yes, God is going to deliver me through his means. And so what a wonderful comfort, and hopefully a lesson for us, that if we can get to that same place of obedience, of humility, of allowing our own individual desires to be literally crucified with Christ, then through prayer, through trust that God sends help, we can also, as Jesus demonstrated, there is victory on the horizon, not as we see it, but can fully trust it's the best thing for us and accomplishes God's will for greater purposes. So whatever our needs may be, let us come to God and let us trust in him and let us seek him in all of our issues of life. And especially if there's anyone who's with us who's never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ, here's an opportunity to fully put your soul and your life in his hands, to truly crucify the flesh of sin and crucify the will that leads us to sin, and to be buried in water and baptism for forgiveness of sins, that we might then be led by Jesus to walk faithfully with him through the one who taught us and showed us that these things don't happen easily, they don't happen on their own, but they happen calling upon God, trusting in his deliverance, and trusting that through our faith we will be rewarded. And what a wonderful blessing that we truly will be rewarded, and that all those who are faithful until death will live forever, for all of eternity. But we ultimately delivered from all the things of this life. But we want to make sure that we offer this invitation and make sure everyone has an opportunity to take advantage of that. And if you're here without Christ, without his sacrifice, having never been baptized, we encourage you to do that if you have, but need to come back to him to be strengthened to walk with him more faithfully. We'll gladly help and assist you in that as well. But whatever your need is, won't you come to the front? We're going to stand and sing a song. Won't you come while we stand and sing?